A very good morning to you. My name is Phil Swan. I'm one of the development managers at the CPD unit at Cardiff University. It's great to have you joining us this morning. Just while we've got people still arriving, I'm just going to welcome you and introduce you to the Learning at Work Week session we've arranged for you this morning. So Learning at Work Week is an annual national event that aims to put a spotlight on the importance and benefits of continuing learning and development. The team behind the successful virtual spring school that have organised the session this morning, looking at the future of storytelling in the workplace. We've run similar type sessions over the last couple of years, and we've put all the videos onto our YouTube channel. So we do encourage you to take a look for those. We'll send out details of those or put that on the chat feature in a second. Just to run through some basic housekeeping with you, the session is being recorded. This means it will also be made available on our YouTube channel following the event. If you have any IT issues during the session, any sound issues, etc., please just use the chat feature and we'll do our best to try and help you. If you have Wi-Fi dropouts, then just reuse the link and we'll readmit you. We've got a couple of people sort of sitting on the sidelines who can readmit you, so it won't interrupt today's session. We're going to do some questions and answers for the session, which will be done at the end. So you can use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen to pose your questions as the presentation's going on, and we'll sort of collect those and do those at the end. And at the end of the session, you'll see a short pulse survey within the Zoom session. So we do encourage you to provide some feedback. We look carefully at this and very much appreciate this. And finally, if you would like to discuss how your organisation can work with Cardiff University, particularly around the area of training, please do give us a call or drop us an email and we'll be very pleased to have a talk with you. So that's it from me. I can see people, it looks like most people have arrived now. So I'll hand you over to Professor Sarah Hurlow, who will be delivering this morning's session. Thanks very much, Sarah.
Thank you very much. We'll just swap screens here for a moment. There we go. Great. So welcome everybody, and thank you for that introduction, Phil. And I'm just really delighted to be here and have the opportunity to talk about such a fascinating topic. Because, you know, I think we are just surrounded by stories. We've got ancient civilizations who drew stories about their lives on the walls of caves. We're aware of some cultures have an oral storytelling tradition where they share their history and values across generations. The news media is constantly telling stories. On the TV, you know, you tune in at 10 o'clock and you'll often hear the phrase, tonight's stories include. And of course, the tabloids thrive on promoting sensational stories. Many of us have grown up listening to the stories that our parents have told us at bedtimes, and we continue to read novels and short stories, as well as watching stories on the television, in dramas and in the cinema with films. We get hooked on the storylines in soap operas. And if you're like me, you know, we binge watch miniseries and can't wait for the next blockbuster to come into the cinema. And of course, we tell stories to each other all of the time as we recount the events of the day. And what do we call it? Gossip. So in this webinar, given that we're surrounded by stories, in this webinar, what I'm going to do is to talk a little bit more about the use of stories in the workplace. We'll start by considering what makes stories so powerful as a form of communication. And then we'll look at the numerous ways that we can use stories to share key organisational messages. We'll also delve a little bit deeper and consider other voices that we might hear and the stories they may be telling in the workplace. And then the last section of the webinar, I'll look a little bit more closely at some of the key elements of what makes a good story. And I'll conclude by suggesting some next steps for you to develop and use your own stories in the workplace. So let's get started. Why are stories everywhere? Well, I think it's because they're a form of communication that produces three powerful responses. First, there's an intellectual response. We enjoy analysing the plot and the characters for their logic. We follow the storylines and we like to work out what might happen next or who did it in a murder mystery. And we look at the characters in terms of our own experiences and think, gosh, would I do that in similar circumstances? Second, we have an emotional response to stories. Now, we like to think that we're rational beings, especially in the workplace, carefully weighing up pros and cons and making decisions based strictly on evidence and reason. But you know, actually, we're driven by our emotions. Feelings of vanity, pride, insecurity, envy. And we see all of that played out in stories in front of us. We dislike the baddie. We fancy the hero or heroine. You feel sorry for the victim, and so on. And we'll often include an emotion when we're summarizing a story. We'll say, oh, that was a scary movie, or oh, the end of that book was so sad. And the power of emotions, I think, is captured in a famous observation by the American civil rights activist Maya Angelou, when she said, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I think that you don't forget how a story makes you feel. And the third thing is that that stories elicit a very strong physiological response. Our intellectual and emotional engagement is manifest in bodily sensations. You know, we stop what we're doing, we lean forward, we hide behind the pillow, our heart pounds, we laugh, we shout at the screen, you know, we've all done it. So you put those three components together and you can see that stories engage the whole person, intellectually, emotionally, and physiologically. And I also think that we can add to that the fact that storytelling is a visual medium. You are imagining the setting, the characters, and the action in your mind. And that sort of thing makes it very easy to remember. And as well as that, telling stories involves other people. So it's a very social medium. You know, we talk about stories going viral, and we talk about gossip spreading like wildfire. So I think that if you put all of that together, you can see that stories are incredibly powerful and they've got huge potential for communicating important messages in the workplace. Now, organisations have got several different types of stakeholders. You've got clients, suppliers, customers, and employees. And there are important messages that each of these need to hear and understand. So rather than just deliver the bald facts, data, vision, or results, why not tell a story? Because it enables you to engage with each of them intellectually, emotionally, and physiologically. And of course, it makes your story easy for them to recall and share. Now, an American author and speaker, Paul Smith, has written an interesting book on storytelling. And he's identified 10 stories that leaders or managers in organizations should be telling. And you can see how he's grouped them there into 3 sections. You know, the first group are about setting direction stories. Then we've got, you know, who the organization is type stories. And finally, personal stories. And it's interesting that he's included there a story about, you know, just communicating with people, your leadership philosophy. And if I go back a slide, I think as well as these big leadership messages, We should be telling stories to communicate day-to-day performance expectations with our team. There's lots of opportunities in meetings, in the corridor, in emails, to tell short, relevant and impactful stories to help people with decision-making, to motivate, to inspire, and so on. Now, this is all about using stories to make sense for other people, especially where there may be some uncertainty about circumstances or the best way forward. But I think it's also important to stand back a little when we're talking about storytelling in the workplace, because some people have started to question the way that storytelling has become so popular. And first of all, I think, we've got to acknowledge that storytelling has the potential to be rather manipulative. Now, we're all too aware of story and counter-story in politics, driven by different ideological positions. And this then links with a concern about how stories tend to simplify reality. They tend to see the world in black and white, good versus evil. And we lose the shades of grey and complexity that really characterize our everyday experience. Tyler Cowen, who's a professor of economics at George Mason University in Virginia, features in a very interesting TED talk called Be Suspicious of Stories. And in it, he worries about important detail being stripped out of stories that we tend to hear in the media and politicians, and potentially in organizations. Now, I said at the beginning that we're surrounded by stories, and we all make use of them to make sense of who we are, to make sense of what's going on, to make sense of what we should be doing. And, we tell stories of our family, of our holidays, of our careers, stories about meetings, stories about work incidents. So what I'm suggesting is that organizations are alive with rich and multiple stories about people's lived experience. There are some stories that are just kicking off, some that will just wither, that won't go anywhere, and some that won't finish for quite some time. They're continually unfolding. And so many researchers have become interested in gathering stories as data. This is often referred to as narrative inquiry. And they're interested in analysing stories to look at the layers of meaning that we find in organisations and the underlying values and assumptions that people have in different contexts. Here's just a range of paper article titles that people have written in this area. If we just look at one of them there, the top one, written by Graham Curry and Andy Brown, they gathered stories told by senior and middle managers in the health service in a particular hospital where significant change was being introduced. And they realised that the two groups of people were telling radically different versions of the same change initiative. And it was serving to kind of legitimise their contrasting positions and actions in the organisation. So I guess not surprisingly, you have the senior managers depicting themselves very formally and as being rational and in command. And they were telling stories about business planning and strategy development. They were very optimistic and quite romantic narratives about positive change. But they were also casting middle managers as resistant and intransigent to their good ideas. And then the stories that the middle managers were telling were much more pessimistic, if not quite tragic narratives, because they saw the changes being imposed, kind of universal solutions, which weren't recognizing the kind of nuanced and and subtle differences between parts of the hospital. And they talked about being distracted from serving the real needs of patients and lacking the authority to make decisions. So you can see that we've got two groups of people with oppositional stories when they're meant to be working together. And as I say, none of this is a surprise, but looking at it as the kind of the stories that are circulating, it helps us and understand change perhaps in a different way and a more effective way, where we can expose the different parties to those different stories and help them think through the meaning there. I think there's also something about recognizing there may be stories that are unheard, marginal, even dismissed or suppressed in different contexts, when they actually do have value. And, you know, you might describe this as a case of, excuse me, telling truth to power. So, for example, the telling of patients' stories has become very important in recent years. And here are two examples, the one from Cardiff and Vale Health Board locally, and the other nationally from the Patient Voice Initiative, where they've both been finding stories from patients and their families and sharing them so that they can communicate the kind of lived experience of people on the receiving end of treatment, and thereby improve and inform service delivery. And I guess, you know, increasingly I'm seeing social enterprises making digital stories to explain their purpose and the impact that they're having, and communities coming together to use stories to build unity and activism. You know, there's this idea that collective stories can change the conversation. So I think the message across all of these pause issues I've raised is that it's really important to stand back and become aware of stories in your workplace. Who's telling them and why? And who doesn't have a voice, and what story should they be telling? Now, whatever sort of story you're telling, to be effective, it should contain some key elements. And this diagram here captures the elements and their relationships. You know, a story is like going on a journey, and that journey is described using the term of kind of narrative arc. So at the beginning there, you're setting up the story. You're establishing the world in which the protagonist exists prior to them embarking on the journey. It's about the status quo. And then there's that rising tension as the protagonist is presented with some sort of obstacle or challenge that they must overcome. And it exposes a vulnerability in some way. And, you know, ultimately we reach a point of highest tension, which is a kind of decisive turning point for the protagonist. How are they going to respond? And usually it's some sort of kind of aha moment, and we experience a kind of an emotional release as there's some resolution. And this is where the journey ends, and we return to what we might describe as a new normal that has benefited from some significant transformation or insight from the protagonist. So in the last part of this webinar, what I'm going to do is to take a look at some of these components in turn, so that I hope you might have a little bit more insight when you come to developing your own stories that you might tell in the workplace. So here are some famous story openings. It was a dark and stormy night. How many stories were you told as a child that started with that? You know, it's a bit dramatic and conventional, but very well known. And here's another interesting one. It was a bright and cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Some of you may be familiar with that. It comes from the novel 1984 by George Orwell. A very intriguing opening. And then here's another one. This one is actually from Charles Dickens. It was The Best of Times and the Worst of Times, A Tale of Two Cities. And, you know, it really draws you in. There's a hook there. Gosh, good and bad. What's going on here? So this setting of the story, the way that it starts, is really important because it sets the scene. Stories don't exist in a vacuum. There's a very particular setting, context, and time. And your audience needs to be placed there and given the necessary background so that the unfolding story makes sense. So I'd suggest that you do a little preparatory work to get this right. And perhaps run through the senses to flesh out that scene setting, but do keep it simple. The next thing I think that you need to think about are the characters in your story, because they really embody the message and your audience must be able to connect with them. So don't use somebody famous, you know, oh, this happened to Richard Branson or something. You're not in the same world. And also don't use something disembodied, like, oh, did you hear what happened to the company? This was the challenge, this is what they did. Again, it's just too abstract. So it really needs to be someone that the audience can relate to. In fact, they could see themselves in that situation. You know, I could have been, or I have been in that situation. And, you know, this is what I could do, or how there's an interest in how this story compares with what I did do. And going back to those little introductions I listed there, you know, they were really important as a hook. They grabbed the reader's attention. You know, gosh, there's something interesting going on there. What's going to happen? So it's important, if you can, to try and think about starting something that will capture your audience's attention and make them want to know more. You know, how many times have you had coffee with somebody and they say, you'll never guess? And boy, you know, you start guessing. It's also important, I think, to never say, I'm going to tell you a story, because that just sounds so artificial, if not patronizing, and it really turns people off. So it's important to just drop your story in naturally into the conversation. You know, there's a few not very good examples there, so that there's flow and people find it naturally emerging as part of the conversation. So remembering our diagram, we're moving up now to the sort of reaching the top of that curve. And it's very good, or a good story will have that challenge in it, or what's been described as an initiating incident, something that happens that really presents a dilemma. And there's a researcher called Mesereau who describes this as a disorientating dilemma, which is great. Because it's presenting something that's quite high stakes, and it puts out of kilter that status quo that was established at the beginning of the story. They've got to face a fear or a challenge, make a hard choice, something that really stops them and is decisive. You know, they've got to kill a dragon or find 3 bits of a puzzle. It creates tension and energy. And as an audience, you start to really lean in. Ultimately, they will resolve that dilemma or challenge, but they do it only by digging deeper, by finding some truth about themselves or the situation. They have to earn the resolution. And that's really important to really bring something believable or some authenticity to the resolution. And that resolution is all about the take-home message. It's why you devised the story in the first place. There's got to be a moral or big idea that you want to communicate to the audience. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the classic Wizard of Oz film, the American musical, where you have Dorothy as the protagonist who decides to run away, and she enters a fantasy world, and there's this, journey of challenges that she faces. Ultimately, the ultimate challenge is wanting to get back to her family on the farm, which is what the wizard enables. But when she wakes up and kind of vows never to return, never to leave the farm again, she says that it's because there's no place like home. That's the takeaway here. And it's a moral that, illustrates the American ideology of the time and about the importance of family, which was really promoted in classic American cinema of the 1950s. So, we don't want to say something simple and obvious. It's of what that underpinning learning is that really is the punchline for our stories, so that you're implying that there's that learning will make things become different, that people will act in a different way. Now I've put I've got a story here for you, and I'm going to read it out loud because I hope that it kind of captures all of the elements that I've just been talking about. And down the right-hand side there, you can see that I've kind of mapped those key elements, and you'll be able to chart them as I go through the story. I know a young entrepreneur with a growing fashion line. It's very exciting. And she was just telling me that on Saturday night, she was enjoying a catch-up with friends over dinner when suddenly an alert popped up on her phone. And it was a message from her biggest customer. It said the shipment hasn't arrived. Well, she was absolutely staggered. And she rushed back to the office, searched through the tracking numbers, and desperately trying to get in touch with someone in the shipping company to find out what had happened. Then she discovered the problem. Beneath a pile of inventory was the box containing the customer's order. It was all packed, labelled and ready to go, but she'd forgotten to send it. It was late. She checked the clock. It was 11 o'clock. What could she do? It was too late to actually ship the package. And she knew that the customer needed it for 10 o'clock, a store opening the next day. What was she to do? She grabbed the box, ran downstairs, hailed a cab and went to the airport. And she got a seat on the next flight to Paris and was able to personally deliver that order to the relieved client before the shop opened. The customer got the order, but was still angry about the mix-up and ended the relationship. Sophie lost the customer for sure, as well as a night's sleep, a day away from the business, and the money on airfares. But it was then that she realised something important. Her company was getting too big to run on her own. She decided it was time to grow, and she recruited a new team member. All very nice, but you can see all of those elements in there, and there was that really important crunch message about a micro business needing to grow. Now, on this next slide, again, I've brought all of that together, and I've got a bit of a checklist there that you might refer to as an aid memoir, partly as a little bit of preparatory work. You know, it's so important to think about what's the message I want to get across here, and why that message is important. You know, what problem will it solve, and how will people act differently as the result? And it's really important to think about the characteristics of your audience and what those people are like, because it's going to inform the nature of your protagonist. You might have some choices to make there. And it's about setting the scene. You know, how much do they know already? What else do they really know? Would they need to know? What can they relate to? And then it's important to work a little bit on the actual main character, trying to get a resonance between that key person in the story and the nature of the audience that you're speaking to. Clarifying that context, getting that essential information in there. Being clear about that moment, that inciting incident, and how that dilemma is so disorientating and making the protagonist vulnerable. Be clear about what they did and express it in terms of that digging deeper that they have to do to really learn from this challenge. How did things turn out? What was the core message? And what happens next? So what? Really key things to think about. So in this webinar, I've talked about how stories have become incredibly popular. And I think that that's because they are so powerful in engaging people intellectually, emotionally, and physiologically. I think you've seen there's a whole range of scenarios that you can actually use stories in, formal and informal. But we mustn't forget how really organizations, our lives are about stories. They're all around us, swimming around, some finished, some unfinished, some go on and on. But it's important to stop and reflect on them in terms of, you know, who's telling them and why. And also, I hope helped by unpicking some of those really key storytelling elements and illustrated a little bit. And as something that, you know, elements that you can think about in terms of developing your own stories. And really, that is the next step. And what I would suggest to you is that you might now become much more aware of stories that are surrounding you. And you can really quite deliberately start evaluating the purposes that they're serving, how well they're being structured and communicated, and indeed who isn't telling stories, but stories that probably your organization would benefit from hearing, and what you can do to help those stories being told. A second thing I think you could do is actually start collecting stories related to particular messages you want to communicate. You know, listen for those triumphs, the disasters, the opportunities that are occurring out there. And how can you use them to share the particular messages that you want to communicate? You then want to refine those stories that you've collected, whether they're about yourself or somebody else. And you can follow the suggestions that I've given, or if you'd like some help refining your stories, I can offer a kind of safe workshop space where we could, you know, I've got worksheets and little mini exercises that will support you in the development of your stories. And indeed, if you want to build the capacity for your organization to tell stories, do get in touch. And perhaps we can talk about working up a kind of bespoke session for groups of people in your organization. Both those who, in leadership positions, who can use this as a technique to enhance their storytelling, and also for you enabling other important stories to be told. So good luck, and I hope that there are more stories proliferating out there that you're championing.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was really interesting. We do have a couple of questions that have come through. So if it's okay, I'll just put those to you now. Just a reminder to everyone else, if you would like to put a question as we're going through these ones, please just use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. So the first question that's come through: how do you balance the emotive storytelling with data and evidence? Is there a balance, or is it more powerful to reduce data references when telling stories?
Yeah, the first thing you're trying to do is to really engage people with the data in the first place. So once you've got them on side, probably with a kind of an emotive element, if they're interested, they can look at the detail themselves subsequently. So I think that it's important to initially to work on the emotive element at the expense perhaps of some of the fine detail, because you've then won them over and they will do the nitty-gritty work themselves.
That's great. The next question was: how should leaders recognise and manage other stories? So the stories that are different from other ones they are telling, especially when leading change.
I think it's absolutely fundamental to acknowledge other stories, because otherwise those stories will be circulating and they become negative, they become adversarial stories. So I think that as part of that change process, you acknowledge that, you think you're proposing a particular story, which makes sense given the evidence, experience, insights that you have, but that you really want to hear the other stories and make opportunities for them to be told. And you need to engage with them. What is the moral in those stories? Are you actually overlooking something that's important and that you should acknowledge? So absolutely, I think good change management is about surfacing all of those stories and engaging with them positively.
Thank you. And the next question: any advice on sharing sensitive or triggering stories to an unknown audience?
Well, yes. They can be quite powerful, but I think that it's about just being very careful how you set the scene for those stories, and perhaps obscure some, revealing or personal issues. It's just being respectful, I think, is the issue there.
And the next one starts with a comment: really interesting, thank you. I'm intrigued by the manipulative aspects of storytelling. Often in the workplace, communication is around affecting change. So how can you ensure that your stories don't sound manipulative?
Yes, a very good question. When so many stories do sound manipulative. I think it's about your stories containing that honesty. It's going back to that question that was asked earlier. It's acknowledging that there are multiple perspectives in organizations that reflect different sets of experiences, different specialisms, different expertise, and that when you're presenting your, if you like, preferred story, you need to open space for other stories, having perhaps found them already, saying, yes, I can realize that some may see this scenario in this way, others may see it that way, so that you aren't being unnaturally black and white, I think, because then people do start to be a little bit skeptical and think that you've sanitized things too much.
The next one's a nice short one. Do you have any tips on how to decide how long a story should be?
I think it really depends on the context, both in terms of what you're trying to communicate and the scenario in which you are communicating it. And it may be that you have a story that can be enlarged for certain scenarios and condensed for that quick corridor conversation, where somebody comes to you and says, oh, do you know, I've got this problem, I'm not sure what to do. And you can very quickly say, do you know, I encountered that last week. So-and-so had this challenge. He really thought that, the game was up with this particular client, but do you know, done. Whereas in a meeting, perhaps, where perhaps some of the detail is important, you can elaborate. So it's a little bit of judgment. And I think you learn it as you trial some of the stories.
Oh, so the next one sounds like it might be quite good for your workshop that you mentioned. But the question is, we do department updates from our leadership team and have some diverse updates they would want to tell everyone about. But we've been asked to have a story to tie it all together. So it's easier, nicer to hear. How would you recommend we do this?
Okay, so again, I'll bring you back to those fundamentals. You want to tie it all together. So is there some underlying core message? Tease that out and then think about incidents you've experienced or other people in your team that capture that story, that capture that message and can bring it to life in a story. So I think, it'll take a little bit of work, a little bit of brainstorming, but it's not selling a story for a story's sake. It's got to have a purpose. And I think that's what your team needs to talk about. What's the nature of those updates? Is there some underlying message that you want to get across that unites them? And then think about an incident, an occasion that can carry that message.
And the next question, any tips on how projects can better use storytelling to influence future policy and programme developments?
Oh, wow, that really is interesting. Yes, so I guess some sort of report would emerge from a project to go to key stakeholders. And traditionally, you've got your abstract and your sections, the process, the findings and so forth. And it's just people will kind of go, oh God, yeah, and put it in the pile. So I think using a storytelling approach would be provocative, it would be engaging, there would be some novelty. And so again, I would go back and think about, what is the key point we want to make so that it informs future policy making? Let's try and distill 1 or 2, 3, and then find stories of our experience as we went through the project, both in terms of the process and its impact that captures that message, and put that in the abstract. That's the first thing that hits the reader. And then you might have some others dotted through the story to reinforce or to explore other aspects. Go for it.
Thanks, Sarah. The next question's one just to clarify. So if I understand the reservation about storytelling correctly, it's about being authentic and having positive intentions within the organisation. So is that a...
Oh, yeah, yes, absolutely. And the fact that I think that perhaps stories have got a beginning, a middle, and end. They wrap everything up neatly. There are no loose ends. Whereas in reality, organizations are full of stories that are going in multiple different directions and perhaps aren't neat. It's actually the difference between using the word story and narrative. Story is that finite, closed thing, whereas narrative is communicating a kind of unfolding system of stories that you get in the workplace. So I think that with that in mind, it's about realizing that you are not oversimplifying reality and just seeing things perhaps in terms of goodies and baddies, that there's some texture there. So don't overdo the stories and don't make them too simplistic if really you want to capture the power that they do have.
That's great. And we've got just 2 questions left. And just a quick thank you to everyone who's posted the questions. The engagement's been really good, so thanks for that. So the second to last question: sometimes key stakeholders just want the facts and to be straight to the point. Do you have any advice on how you can deliver a story whilst meeting the stakeholders' expectations?
Well, again, I think this is to do with your homework. It's you know, often with clients, there's a message you want to get across to them, and there's also things that interest them, and they do overlap. But you know, you've got to be aware of the things you want to say that they may not want to hear, and things they want to hear that you may not want to say. So there's some homework to be done there. Really being clear about respective messages and information, and really understanding who they are. And so that goes back to the point somebody was making before about how, you know, you've got to tailor the message for the audience and you've got to tailor the story for the audience and the message. And so, you know, it could be something short and sharp, or you could start with the data, but then gently go into a story so that you are using your homework and understanding of the person, the stakeholder that you're working with, to know how best to pitch and kind of run that meeting.
Thank you. And do you think we can use these techniques to explain a research idea, especially mine is about parenting experiences?
100%, 100%. And I think the research has got a number of different audiences. You've got an academic audience, and they're interested in certain parts of it. And they have a very particular way of telling the research story in academic journals. There's a formula there. But you've also got other audiences for your research, you know, the end users, or the, you know, the people that it actually impacts. And you need to tell that story of the research in a very different way. It's not belittling, you know, the huge amount of work you've put into gathering data and making good choices about data analysis and so forth, and knowing the literature. But that sort of detail goes into your story for the academic audience. Other audiences want the story told differently. And it comes right back again, know your audience, and what is that take-home message? What's the moral of the story, of your research story that you want to communicate? 100% suitable for research stories.
That's great. I know I said 2 more, but there's another one that's just come in, a really nice practical question. So I'm just going to finish up with this last one. Do you have any recommendations or experience of using third parties to convey a story? So, for example, graphics, short videos for a PowerPoint, etc.
Definitely, definitely. And in fact, I'm just on a course myself at the moment that is about digital storytelling. And I'm learning all of the kind of editing techniques to help me tell a story using my iPhone as a camera. And I've got my story ready. I've done all of everything I've been trying to tell you to do. But the next step for me is to communicate it visually. with a bit of a voiceover. And in that sense, you could say that that's a sort of third party option for telling stories, and particularly valuable for communities, social enterprises, and so forth.
That's great. Thank you very, very much, Russ. So I think that probably concludes this morning's session, if that's okay. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming along to this morning's session. And I would like to thank Sarah Hurlow for a really fascinating insights and session this morning. And just a quick reminder to everyone that we'll be putting this video on the YouTube channel. The CPD unit has lots and lots of videos from previous years on the channel as well. So please feel free to take a look at those. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.